the presidential election of 1788 to 1789. Summer 1787. It's the end of the American Revolution. Feelings are on the rise, everyone is happy again, and the Continental Congress agrees on one thing in particular. You see this king right here, King George? They don't really like this dude. They don't like King George. They don't want no kings. They're really scared about what would happen if the government became too powerful. They didn't want that whatsoever. So the Continental Congress got together and they created the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were very, very weak. They didn't allow the government to really collect tax. They didn't let the federal government form a military. They didn't let the federal government print their own money. It was just generally a very weak government, and the states had the power. It didn't take very long for the Continental Congress and the United States as a whole to realize that the Articles of Confederation were really, really bad. Many members of the Continental Congress reconvened for the Constitutional Convention. There was a lot of arguing, a lot of bickering between members, but through it all, one person stood out: George Washington. He was a leader during this time, and he's not unfamiliar to the Continental Congress. He was a colonel during the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. He was famously a general during the American Revolution. This is a famous picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware River. He was generally a pretty popular guy all around. So, the Continental Congress drafted the United States Constitution. The Constitution basically made all of the 13 individual colonies into one union together. They decided to, instead of having one branch of government, the legislative branch or the Continental Congress, they decided to split their government up into 3 separate branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch consisted of each state electing people to represent them in Congress. Each state was given 2 senators, and each state was given a certain number of representatives based on their population. The executive branch would be headed by a president of the United States. The president would serve 4-year terms with elections every 4 years. One thing that the Continental Congress needed to agree on was how to elect a president of the United States. Should the president be elected by Congress, a parliamentary system? The framers thought against that. They didn't really like parliamentary system. It reminded them too much of Britain, most likely, so they decided against that. Should the president be elected by the popular vote? They also decided against that, mostly because it wasn't very practical and they were pretty scared of mob rule. So the question arose, how do you elect a president? Well, through the Electoral College. The Electoral College is an electoral system where the people vote for electors who will then vote for the President of the United States. It's a system that has been in place in the United States since 1787 and continues to be a part of the United States still to this day. Hold on a second here. What is the Electoral College? What does it mean? What does it do? Well, the Electoral College is made up of electors. The electors are from each individual state, and the electors will vote for a President of the United States. Well, how do you decide how many electors each state gets? Well, the electors in each state are equal to the amount of senators added with the amount of representatives from each state. You add the 2 senators and the representatives up, and that's how many electors your state gets when electing a president. Hold on a second there, said the Anti-Federalists, or framers against the ratification of the Constitution. They thought that an executive authority like the president would be very bad for the country. They compared it to a king, and they just fought a revolution against the king. They didn't really want kings. They worried about the government becoming too powerful under a unitary executive. They were very nervous about the Constitution, and they didn't really want to ratify it. James Madison, a Federalist, or someone who was in support of ratification of the United States Constitution, made a deal with the Anti-Federalists that the fully ratified Constitution would include a Bill of Rights to protect individuals from the government. So, the Anti-Federalists got on board with the Constitution, and it was ratified. The Anti-Federalists, though, were a little bit skeptical of the Constitution still, even though they had voted to ratify it. So now, December 1788. People are voting for President of the United States. So who are the people voting for in this election? Well, they're voting for George Washington. George Washington was a leader during the American Revolution, and he was a leader during the Constitutional Convention. The Anti-Federalists and the Federalists disagreed on a lot of issues, but there was one thing they both agreed on, is that George Washington should be elected president. It would make them very happy if George Washington became president. It's something they all agreed on. It just made sense. He was a leader during the Revolution. He was a leader during the Constitutional Convention. He should be the first president of the United States. Choosing how the Electoral College works would become a very big headache for the framers of the Constitution. The framers wanted each of the individual states to be able to choose how their electors were chosen. So some states would have different methods of choosing electors than other states would. They wanted each state to be unique and have their own say in how each elector was chosen. So for example, New York State would have a different method of choosing their electors than, let's say, Virginia. The electors would be chosen by really two main methods: popular vote, legislature, or the third method, which is electoral districts. Method 1, state legislature. The states of Connecticut, Georgia, South Carolina, and New Jersey chose their electors through the state legislature. Massachusetts was a little bit different. Massachusetts voters would write in two names in particular for their electors, and then the state legislature would vote on who out of the pool of names would be the electors for the state. For these 5 states in particular, the state legislature would choose the electors who would then go on to choose the president. New York was supposed to be one of these 5 states, or I guess 6 states. However, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists both controlled a house of the New York State Legislature, and they could not choose how New York would appoint their electors, so it fractured them and caused an electoral deadlock, which prevented New York State from actually being able to vote in the 1788 to 1789 election. Method 2, the popular vote. Pennsylvania and Maryland had a popular vote, statewide popular vote, or a general ticket popular vote for deciding the president. New Hampshire had a little bit of a minor system, but it's basically the same thing. They had a popular vote method. This method is the exact same to how it works now. The voters will vote for a president. The president will then choose the electors that he wants, and those electors will very likely vote for him for president. Method 3, electoral districts. In Virginia and Delaware in particular, they split up their states into different electoral districts. In each district, there was separate votes for who should be an elect. It was kind of a proxy vote. You would vote for an elector who would then vote for president. You would vote for one elector, though, not the group of electors, just one. And then method 4, these states did not ratify the Constitution, so they did not get to participate in the election of 1788 to 1789. When electors get their ballot, they will vote for 2 candidates. Out of the pool of candidates that the electors voted for, the person in first place will become president of the United States, and the person in second place will become vice president of the United States. Now, George Washington was very well liked and very popular amongst voters and amongst the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, so everyone knew he was already going to become president. However, there was a fight for who would become second place and who would become the vice president. John Adams was the Federalist pick for vice president, and he was the front runner to become vice president. George Clinton was the Anti-Federalist pick for vice president. Alexander Hamilton, one of the framers of the Constitution and authors of the Federalist Papers, was starting to be a little bit suspicious of the Anti-Federalists. Alexander Hamilton knew that Federalist electors would vote for John Adams as their second choice for president. Alexander Hamilton began to suspect that Anti-Federalist electors, in an effort to sabotage the Constitution of the United States, would vote for John Adams as their first choice for president. Thus, John Adams would beat George Washington and become the president of the United States, and George Washington would become the vice president, or in Anti-Federalist best case scenario, George Clinton might end up becoming the vice president of the United States. Needless to say, this would be very embarrassing for the new Constitution. Everyone agreed on George Washington becoming president. It was a unanimous thing. So if John Adams suddenly became elected president, it would be pretty embarrassing for the country. Alexander Hamilton devised a plan to prevent this from happening. He told his Federalist electors to scatter the votes among multiple Federalist candidates So that way, John Adams could not end up beating George Washington. After weeks of counting votes over the spread of 2 years, 1788 and 1789, which is the first and only time that's ever happened, the results were finally in. George Washington won unanimously. He won every single state and every single elector in the country as their first vote. He became the president-elect of the United States. Washington received 100% of the electoral vote and also 100% of the popular vote. Second place was John Adams. He won 46.6% of the second choice for votes, and he became the vice president of the United States. George Washington was sworn in as president on April 30th, 1789, to the cheers of Federalists and Anti-Federalists across the country.